Thank you, and welcome to the final plenary of Energy Finance 2022. We also welcome our online audience to join our folks here in the auditorium in New York. Our last session is called Accelerating Renewables, Transitioning to a Zero Emissions Grid. I'm pleased to introduce Ingrid Vila-Biaggi, who will moderate this session. Ingrid is the Vice President of the IEEFA Board of Directors and the co-founder and president of Cambio, a nonprofit organization in Puerto Rico that designs, promotes, and implements sustainable policies and practices. Together with the environmental, labor, and community groups, as well as energy experts, she coordinates and collaborates in Queremos Sol, We Want Sun, an equitable energy sector transformation proposal for Puerto Rico based on rooftop solar and storage that establishes a 100% clean renewable goal by 2050. Ingrid is an engineer and also held positions in the public sector, including serving as Chief of Staff for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Now let me turn this over to Ingrid to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone. It is my pleasure to moderate this closing discussion with such a formidable panel. In this last piece, our speakers will take us from India's case for decarbonization to a look at Australia's progress and road ahead to achieve a 100% renewable future, to a world overview of what is needed to finance a net zero grid. Breaking off with the current fossil fuel model will generate losses for powerful political and economic sectors that will continue to resist change. It is no longer a matter of not knowing the answers or not having the solutions. It becomes a matter of how we overcome an extractive and predatory economic construct that seems inoculated from notions of common good and public interest. Although Puerto Rico's case will not be explicitly discussed in this panel, I do want to take the occasion to point out that even though we are a speck in comparison to Australia and India, we share many of the same issues that will be discussed here, but with an important difference: the added burden of continuing to be a colony of the United States. So in Puerto Rico, we cannot talk about an equitable renewable future without talking about decolonization. Right now, decisions are being made by a congressionally appointed fiscal oversight board who represents bondholder interests with no consideration for what the people of Puerto Rico need or want. Energy has become a coveted area for the board, who has pushed for disastrous privatization schemes, forcing public sector workers out of their jobs, enticing dubious natural gas corporations with new methane gas plants that we certainly don't need, and threatening to tax rooftop solar to ensure a captive client base for debt repayment. Puerto Ricans know that we need to move quickly to rooftop solar and storage. Those who can are already doing so at a pace of 2,000 new net metering connections per month. But with a population where almost half live under poverty levels, this means that those who need it most continue to be left behind. Puerto Ricans need to do better at electing public officials, but we need to be in equal footing and not have to fight imperial authorities to provide for basic needs. There is no doubt that this bright and achievable renewable future that Puerto Ricans want, that Australians want, that people in India want, and that is gaining ground all over the world will cause significant shifts in power and in wealth distribution, and thus requires the creation of needed political will to drive policy towards phasing out fossil fuel and leveraging available capital and capacity to integrate renewables at a fast pace. I hope this closing discussion will leave us motivated and with a clear vision of what needs to happen to accelerate renewable adoption and attain a zero emissions grid. Joining this great panel today, we have Ashish Fernandes, who has over 2 decades of experience on climate and energy issues globally and in India. He established Climate Risk Horizons in 2020 to provide research and economic analysis to drive India's energy transition from dirty to clean and move India's financial system towards action on the climate crisis. He has a bachelor's in economics from St. Xavier's College in Mumbai. Joining us as well today is Johanna Bowyer, the lead research analyst for Australian electricity at IEEFA. Her research is focused on trends in the national electricity market, energy policy, and decarbonization. Prior to joining IEEFA, Johanna researched distribution networks at CIRO, worked as an engineer at Solar Analytics and Suntech, and worked as management consultant at Kearney. Johanna has a first-class honors degree in photovoltaics and solar energy engineering from UNSW Australia. And last but certainly not least, Dhruba Purkayastha is the India Director for Climate Policy Initiative, a global nonprofit research and advisory institution working on sustainable green climate finance. He has served as program manager for the International Finance Corporation and as a senior specialist in the South Asia Friends and Private Sector Unit of the World Bank. He has over 25 years of experience in credit rating, management consulting, investment banking, and international development financing. So let's get this discussion started.
Thanks, Ingrid. So I'm going to talk a bit about what's happening in India, where we see things going in terms of the grid and decarbonization, what the potential is and what's holding us back. The good news, we could all do with some good news. In India, RE is increasingly cheap and coal is increasingly expensive. So replacing that obviously gives you a chance to generate system-wide savings and gives you a very strong financial and economic case. The cost of grid electricity has been going up, even as RE has been going down. A number of reasons for that, but basically what that does mean is, if you just do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, this financial year, India will probably generate about 1,200 billion units of coal power. Just replacing that with cheaper RE gives you a huge amount of savings. We calculated about somewhere around 7 billion. Now, of course, that's just to give you a size, an indication of what the size of the pie is, because you have transmission costs and your battery storage costs, all of those things will eat into it. But that is potentially what we're looking at. On a longer term horizon, 2050, there's been analysis that's come out recently by a Finnish university that looked at what the grid costs would be, the entire electricity costs for India, if it was 100% RE, and they said it would reduce costs by 40%. The total LCE of the system would come down significantly, and this takes into account what the likely cost trajectory is for wind and solar over the next 3 or 4 decades. But of course, there are limitations to a 2050 horizon, because that is really not an argument that flies with planners. They want to know what's happening in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years at the most. So what we have done is start to look at, on that shorter term time horizon, what are the savings, what are the economic and financial arguments for transition? We have looked at the direct savings from retiring and replacing electricity from old coal power plants. India has a significant fleet of coal power plants that are 20 years and older. So either at the end of life, economic life, or nearing that end of economic life. What are the costs of that electricity, and what savings can you generate by replacing that with RE? The savings also include things like retrofit costs, because the older power plants would need retrofits if they were to continue running. There will be penalties for excessive air emissions. That's still something that's going through the Indian system, but sooner or later there will be some kind of penalty. And the fact that when you take off the older coal power plants, which are legacy plants, you can rationalize the coal supply lines and in fact lower the freight costs for the remaining plants that continue to be online for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. So we tried to tabulate what these savings are, and we did this in a good amount of detail for the 9 states that you can see highlighted on the map there. And I'm not going to read through all the figures, but the savings can be significant looking at all of these states and only the old coal power plants in those states. If you were to look at power plants, irrespective of age, that are selling power above a certain threshold. That in Indian rupees, that would be 4 rupees a kilowatt hour, which is close to double what new RE would be right now. The savings are even larger. I'm just going to go to 3 specific examples. These are all large states in India. They have a significant industrial base, so they are not by any means small economies. The savings do add up. Maharashtra, which is one of the most developed states, totally we're talking about close to $10 billion in terms of savings. That's the potential over there. Tamil Nadu is a little bit less, 5 billion. Andhra Pradesh is around in the same range as well. So the issue that we're running into is that when you go, most of these plants are owned by state government utilities, right? So they're run by the state government, they're state assets. No bureaucrat wants to give up their state assets, right? So what's the argument there? We did work with Girish. I don't know if Girish is up there. So basically looking at what is the argument that you can take to planners and to bureaucrats and government, basically, that gives them a way to maintain their asset but repurpose it and reuse it in a sensible way. So looking at all of these coal power plants, like I said, about 40 odd gigawatts potentially in India is already ripe for retirement. What can we do with that land? What can we do with the infrastructure that already exists there? How can that be repurposed for the energy transition? So there's a mixture of on-site solar PV, battery storage, synchronous condensers using the old equipment from the plant. And what does that look like in terms of savings then? What are the financial benefits of that? We've just released a detailed analysis looking at 4 plants in the southern state of Tamil Nadu. And for almost all of them, the total capex required to repurpose it is less than the financial benefits that would accrue over a 10-year time frame. So the economic case is extremely strong for repurposing these. It does give the state utility a transition pathway as well, because they can start looking at then retiring their old plants, and as we learn by doing, you can start expanding that to look at other power plants that are perhaps not as old yet. But that all sounds very good, but we still have new coal coming online in India. We have about 25 gigawatts that is under construction right now. Some of those power plants started construction 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and they're just now going to be coming online. Some power plants have started construction in the last 2 or 3 years. And the problem that is posing is that because they are all almost entirely state-owned assets, there's no real private investment in new coal happening in India. The way the contracts are structured, the state utility and the state DISCOM, distribution company, is going to be on the hook for those fixed costs. Even though there's overcapacity in the Indian power system, the DISCOM is on the hook for those fixed costs. And what that means is when they're on the hook for those fixed costs, overall costs for consumers go up, and there's less space then for renewables to start coming in. So we're actually at the stage in India where I fear that if we continue to build new coal, that is actually going to start affecting how much new RE we can actually get online. And that's going to be a big problem, because everybody talks about India's very ambitious renewable energy targets, but those targets, we've already not met them for this year. But it's going to be increasingly difficult to meet them as long as we continue also building new coal. These are decisions that are being made for political reasons by and large, because there is no real economic or financial case for new coal, as many of us have been saying for years now. We did a detailed analysis for a couple of plants in Tamil Nadu, and the figures up there in terms of how much that means in terms of new debt for the state government, which is already struggling financially, by the way. Also in terms of the electricity cost is going to be close to double what it would be with battery storage. So it's from renewables and battery storage. So it's not even, it just makes no economic sense, frankly. So I'm just going to end here with a kind of summary. So the financial case for the transition is very clear, no matter what time scale you look at, whether you're looking at the long-term time scale of 2050, 2070, or even you're looking at the 5-year or 10-year time scale to start phasing down some of the old coal power plants, replacing them with RE. That financial case is very strong. There are ambitious official targets in place from the central government in terms of what India is aiming for RE, which is great. But that needs a lot of investment, and Dhruba is going to talk about that. We need investment to decommission, we need investment to repurpose those power plants, and we need investment in new renewables and storage. Storage, I think, is a critical piece of the puzzle that is still missing. We need to prove low-cost battery storage can actually work and deliver at scale in the Indian context. At the moment, we don't really have those examples. There's a lot that's going on, a lot of different figures floating around. LBNL has one set of figures. Other people have different sets of figures in terms of what that would cost. And that's actually causing a lot of uncertainty in the system. So cracking that piece of the puzzle is important. The power of the incumbent coal industry is a serious challenge. The reason why, I can give you an example. 3 years ago, the Central Electricity Authority, which is a government body, said that India could retire up to about 40 odd gigawatts of coal over the next 10 years. They have now scaled that target down to only about 4 gigawatts, without any explanation as to what's changed. So, I mean, those of us who know how things work, yes, there's probably some political angle at play over there. So the incumbent coal industry is still pushing expansion, is still leaving the door open for new power plants, for new coal mines, even though if India were to meet its RE targets, there is no real space for new coal. So it's politics, not economics, that's calling the shots. And I think that's something that we need to grapple with. I'll end there, but all the data and the research that I cited, that's all available on our website, so I urge you to go to it, and if you have any questions, just get in touch with me, and yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Johanna, and I'm the research analyst looking at Australia's electricity system at IEEFA. And today I'll be discussing the move towards a decarbonised electricity system and what we're seeing in Australia. First, we'll look at what could a decarbonised electricity system look like, what do the 100% renewable studies tell us, and then we'll look at the Australia case study and figure out what are some learnings from Australia and what else is needed to get Australia to a higher penetration of renewables. So I'll give a brief run through of some 100% renewable energy studies. So there's a whole field of research that looks at future energy systems and determines whether 100% renewables is possible. And a lot of these research studies are focused on the energy supply, which is mainly coming from solar energy and wind energy, because they're some of the lowest cost forms of energy we have available. And then that might also be backed up by hydro, geothermal, bioenergy, ocean energy. The studies also look at how to manage the energy supply demand balance. So how do we make sure that we can use renewable energy when it's available and better match up supply with demand? And that can be done using energy storage and demand response. And then the studies also focus on the demand side. So how do we use energy more efficiently, and how can we actually use a 100% renewable electricity system to then decarbonise other sectors of the economy like transport, buildings and industry. And many of these 100% renewable studies find that 100% renewables is possible worldwide and at low costs. Various studies present different end cases. There's a LUT University study that found 100% renewable energy system is possible, including sectors such as heat and power and transport. A Stanford study also found that it is possible for all energy sectors to be run on renewable energy, and the payback for the investment would only be 6 years, which is very low. And another interesting study came out of NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, and that actually found that it is quite cheap to move to 80–90% renewable energy, but then moving from say 90% to 100% might be a bit more expensive because you have to start using technologies that have higher costs than solar and storage and wind. And you all might have seen the International Energy Agency's Net Zero 2050 pathway, and that found that renewables globally would be 90% of the electricity supply in 2050, and mainly wind and solar would be the dominant sources of energy. What all of these studies have in common is that wind and solar electricity are low cost, and they're probably going to be the backbone of the energy systems going forward. So we'll look a little bit at Australia's case study. So Australia has been making good progress towards increasing the amount of renewables in the grid. We've been installing renewables at record rates, and we have 31% renewables in 2021. But on the other side of the equation, the demand side, while we have been making some progress on energy efficiency, there's still a lot of ways to go in terms of efficiency and electrification. And energy storage and demand response also has a lot more work that's required to get us to a higher amount of those technologies. And we have different situations in different states in Australia. So we call South Australia a window into the future because it had 62% renewables in 2021. And Gabrielle Kuiper and I wrote a report on this, which is available on the IEEFA website. And you can see that South Australia's energy system is kind of providing a guide for many other regions because it has so much wind and solar in the network. The solar is shown in yellow in this chart, and the wind is shown in green. And you can see that solar and wind do complement each other quite well, with the solar in the middle of the day and the wind in the evening in South Australia. And you also see there's gas coming online in the evenings, that's in the orange. And South Australia also does import some coal-fired power from a nearby state, which is in the purple. So there's still a ways to go for South Australia's decarbonisation, but they are aiming to get to 100% net renewables in 2030, planning to put in more battery energy storage systems and potentially become a renewable energy exporter. We have a state in the south of Australia. It's a small island called Tasmania, and that is actually 100% net renewables in 2021. And that's largely been enabled by a lot of hydropower. So the hydropower is shown in the blue, and you can see that makes up a large amount of their energy supply, their electricity supply. But they still do have time periods where they're importing energy from Victoria, which is largely brown coal power. And so Tasmania plans to install more wind energy in the north of the state and export that to other states of Australia. We have a few coal-dominated states in Australia, which are Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. They all have around about 70% coal-fired power in their electricity system. And this example is from New South Wales, the chart on the right. You can see the black is the coal-fired power, and the yellow is the solar, and you can see the yellow solar is definitely displacing the coal, particularly in the middle of the day, particularly in that first day in the image there. And I did a study on this, which is also available on the IEEFA website, looking at the impact of the increasing amount of renewables on coal-fired power in the national electricity market. And we found that because wind and solar have lower operational cost than coal and gas, they are bidding into the market at lower prices, and then therefore they're displacing fossil fuel power. So the volume sold from coal and gas is reducing, and prices are also reducing because the solar and wind is bidding into the market at lower prices. So this is challenging the profitability of the coal-fired power plants in Australia. And we found in the study that the profitability would decline significantly, such that an early closure is likely by 2025. And since we did that study, we found that there was an announcement in the market that one of the largest coal-fired power plants would close by 2025. And there's also been 7 other early coal exit announcements. So that was since 2021. So we've had a lot of early coal exit announcements because it's been very challenging for the coal-fired power plants to operate in this new regime where wind and solar are dominant. And another learning from Australia is that the renewable energy uptake is reducing the exposure to fossil fuel price volatility. So this is an image of the east coast of Australia, the main states in the national electricity market. And you can see the average wholesale electricity price in 2021 is shown in grey, and then the price in 2022 is shown in white. And you can see that in the northern states, prices are higher, and that's been largely attributed to the northern states' dominance with black coal-fired power, and then therefore their exposure to high black coal export prices. And there's also lower interconnection with the southern states. So the southern states, they do enjoy quite good interconnection, which is enabling them to share energy between those regions, and they are seeing lower prices. And another thing you'll notice from this is that wholesale electricity prices have doubled, tripled, or even increased by 5 times from 2021 to 2022 year to date. And that's largely because of high coal and gas prices that we've seen recently, which are affecting many electricity systems around the world. And the high coal and gas prices and also coal-fired outages and coal fuel supply issues led to a really challenging situation in the middle of the year where electricity prices increased to such a point that the market in Australia was actually suspended, and the market operator had to direct generators to go online and go offline. So yeah, we're really seeing that these the fossil fuel price volatility is wreaking havoc in the market in Australia, and many politicians are now realising that we can move away from that dependence on fossil fuels and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels to reduce that exposure to the fossil fuel price volatility. And we had the Federal Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, say, of course, getting more renewables in is the best way, in fact, the only way to provide any possibility of getting downward pressure on energy prices. So it's widely recognised now in Australia that getting more renewables in will help bring prices down. And the coal-dominated states that we went through before, they've been racing ahead towards a renewables-dominated future. There was 1 week, about 2 weeks before the conference, where we had a huge number of announcements from these states. Queensland said that they would put in a renewable energy target, 70% renewables by 2032, and convert all publicly owned coal power stations to clean energy hubs by 2035. And they also have energy storage strategy upcoming and a plan to put in a lot of pumped hydro systems. And Victoria, that same week, also brought in an energy storage target, and AGL, which is an electricity retailer and generator that operates in both Victoria and New South Wales, brought forward coal-fired power plant closure dates in both of those states. And also the first tender was opened in New South Wales to run competitive tenders to replace coal-fired power stations with renewables and storage. So it was a massive week. This was just announcements from 1 week. But yeah, this year in general has been big, and we've had a lot of movement towards renewables in Australia. And the federal government has a goal to reach 82% renewables by 2030. So in order to get there, we need to have a very fast build out of renewables. We need to get, this chart here is from the market operator of the electricity market in Australia, and this is their predictions of where they think the capacity build out is going to happen over the coming years out to 2050. The formatting has obviously gone a bit haywire there, but the yellow is the solar, the green is the wind, the pink is storage, and the blue is hydro, and there's just a tiny little bit of gas there in the darker blue at the bottom. And you can see that coal is reducing. The coal is in the black and the brown, it's reducing down, and a huge amount of new renewables are expected to be built and a huge amount of storage to go with that. And just a small amount of gas, such that Australia will reach 98% renewables in 2050. So this is the most likely scenario for Australia's electricity system from the official operator of the grid. And so it requires a very fast build out. We need 9 times renewables by 2050 and 30 times storage. And yeah, a large amount of replacements need to be put in before the coal-fired power plants exit to make sure that we don't have any energy supply gaps. And there's a huge amount of transmission that needs to be built. So they've developed plans to install renewable energy zones throughout the country and build out transmission to those renewable energy zones. And significant investment is required to achieve this plan. It's 146 billion to 2050 that's required, according to the market operator. And also to get to this renewables future, the grid needs to be modernised. So we had some work done by a guest contributor to IEEFA who looked at what needs to happen to enable the transition to a zero emissions grid. And on the operation side, it's about connecting up all these distributed energy resources systems and having better data flows to enable the system to be integrated and operating efficiently. On the generation side, we're moving from large-scale centralised generators to smaller-scale decentralised generators. And on the grid side, the grid needs to reflect that move and be built out to accommodate renewables. And the consumer is going to be a more active participant in this future energy system. They're not just going to pay for their energy, but they're going to earn and they're going to participate, and their demand is going to be shifted. And the market operator is aiming to be able to operate the grid with 100% instantaneous renewables by 2025. So there's, significant work to do to enable this zero emissions grid. So in conclusion, many studies show that 100% renewable energy systems are possible, and key Australian states are demonstrating that renewables-dominated grids are feasible. And we're learning in Australia that renewables are displacing fossil fuels and reducing exposure to fossil fuel price volatility, and the coal-dominant states are racing ahead and really taking action to move towards renewables. But fast build-out and significant investment and grid modernisation is required to enable electricity sector decarbonisation, which will then enable decarbonisation of other energy sectors in the economy. Thank you.
Maybe it needs to. This is also not started. Okay. While we get that, I can start just talking like this.
Just a moment, we're having a technical issue, so just please pause for just a moment. Thank you.
Yeah, no, okay. Thank you, IEEFA. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to this session to speak on net zero emissions grid.
Accelerating renewables, net zero emissions grid. We have heard the last two speakers speak on two large coal power countries, India and Australia, good and not so good. It's very clear that the future of a net zero emissions grid is essentially scaling up, accelerating renewables. And I think over the last 3 days, it's been underscored very, very effectively. That's the path forward is accelerating renewables, but that requires concomitant, I would say, grid infrastructure to enable renewables and also end use. And what I'll be talking on is essentially, while all of it needs to be done, all of it is the way forward, but there is a need for a certain amount of money to be invested. So what I'm talking about today is not specific to a country, but specific globally, what is the order of money that is required and what is required to be shifted. I think the first few slides, basically what I had put down was that we need growth in renewable. And for this net zero, I would say, net zero emissions grid is a prerequisite to even reaching an overall net zero. If we don't have a net zero emissions grid, net zero in totality is probably a non-starter from a direction point of view. Overall, what is energy transition about? Overall, energy transition is about 3 or 4 steps. Step number 1 is to think about electrifying every human economic activity. And that's the movements that you kind of see in cooking, in moving, in EVs, in transportation. Electrify, change heating, ventilation, cooling, all of it electrify, move away from fossil fuels. So that's your step. And then you clean the electricity that the grid produces, clean the electricity behind it. Yeah, okay, thanks. I think the first few slides, so I was here. So decarbonized grid is a subset of overall energy transition and is possibly the first step to net zero. So we are talking about decarbonizing to net zero entails transitions in all of these following things. But while we talk about all of these following things, it is important to think about that it requires a sharp addition in RE, it requires an extensive scaling up in grid infrastructure, and also towards end-use equipment. All of that put together will give us some sort of a net zero emissions grid. Now, this is what I was talking about. Can I go back to the slide? Go back to the previous slide. You can see those 4 boxes over there. And those 4 boxes is essentially a sequential attempt to reach, I would say, a net zero or a net zero emissions grid. But the fact is, if we don't get the grid to be net zero, and then before that try to phase out fossil fuel plants, no new coal for sure, but I guess this needs a sequenced approach. And in this sequenced approach, I'll come to the investment required. Significant shift in electricity supply mix. I think this graph is essentially not required at this stage because it's been spoken many times over, but it'll allow me to shift to the gap in global climate finance. Now, this is a work that I work for a global institution, US-based nonprofit institution, Climate Policy Initiative, which is focused on climate finance. Now, focused on climate finance, we can see the gap in trillions of dollars, where's the gap between what the world is investing in climate. And this is all of it. This is the total 632 billion tracked across the globe. The requirements get into $3 trillion per annum, and you can see the curve at the top. So this is the kind of gap we are facing as far as climate investments is concerned. A significant part of that is in renewable energy. Now, if you were to look at the investment required in renewable energy and associated grid infrastructure, That needs to move up from what we have been seeing from about $1 trillion to 1.2, 1.2, $4.2 trillion. And these are IEA numbers. Very clearly, the scale up per annum is almost increasing the investment by an order of magnitude for a small subset of the economy by 1 percentage point of GDP. IMF talks about a net investment required, incremental investment required of about 4% of GDP. Now, if the world were to be a single country, even then, I think most economists will agree that it's an impossible trajectory that we are dealing with at this stage. Sorry to be negative here, but the scale of investment required is humongous. Now, what we hear clearly is that the market and the private sector is expected to provide a major share of this investment, and public finance would play a catalytic role. I missed out one point when I showed that graph on climate finance, and I want to bring to table one point. If you total up all dedicated public finance pools available in the world, and their total capital, add GCF, CIFs, CTF, adaptation fund, add all of it, you will not reach $50 billion in total. So that's your public capital available globally. You can add the multilateral development banks, some share of the balance sheet, they're talking about investing about 30% in climate, but even if you total up that, the amount of public capital is far, far short. Therefore, there's a need to look at the markets. Now, where are the investments happening? The investments are happening in China and OECD countries. This is where the investments are happening. This is where, but where is the demand growth for electricity going to come from? Emerging market, developing economies. And if I were to take large economies, I will add Brazil, Indonesia, part of Latin America, South Africa, India. You put all of them, Philippines, Vietnam. Now, all these countries are going to grow because their per capita energy consumption is low. And if renewable energy investments do not happen over there, and that's not where, then this trajectory towards, I would say, a net zero emissions grid at a global level is having a distortion in terms of the direction and path. Now let's look at what are the complexities which exists here. 4 trillion per annum is required as far as by 2030. Over 50% of that is required in emerging markets. The cost of capital in emerging markets is 7x times higher than that in OECD countries. But the cost of abatement, which means every dollar will abate a unit of CO2 at 50% more cost efficiency than in an OECD country. So all of it give you a compelling dimension that not only investments, markets, and public sector needs to shift to renewable and related grid infrastructure, but they need to shift from OECD to what I call EMD, not what I call, IEA calls it EMDE countries. And how is that going to happen is often determined. This is a IEA graph, which tells you that while capital in the world is sufficient in the markets, the cost of capital of investing in an emerging country is far, far higher on an average, coming up to 7x times than that of an OECD country. And let's remember one thing, that for a renewable energy investment, wind, solar associated, battery storage, pump storage, whatever you talk of, the cost of money is the significant and possibly the only cost element which matters. If I give you some numbers which are modeled out on saying what would commercial investors want, just look at it from the top and see the returns that required in some countries which have very, very high potential, very, very high solar potential, is an order of magnitude which is probably inconceivable from a 50% return that you're looking for in an Argentina. But it's a whole spectrum that you're looking at, and why. So here we come to the problem of money. When we come to the problem of money, we realize two things. While we have had the last COP talk about a global association called GFANS, which has got asset owners, asset managers, banks, and insurance companies. If you look at their total 200 trillion, that is the pool that exists, and that 200 trillion, today their investments in renewable energy, apart from saying they need to divest from fossil fuels, which is what I was hearing, but their total investments in renewable energy are less than 5%. Actually, a few years ago, it was about 2%. So we are talking about shifting huge pools of capital towards renewable energy and associated grid infrastructure, and to countries which are non-OECD countries, which makes the problem, compounds the problem, and makes it even more difficult. Capital has a strange ways, and that's very clearly that it's the religion of capital to be risk-based and priced based on risk. Now, those risks will get factored in as investors are looking at it. And some of those risks are so-called known, and some of those risks are unknown. And let's call them black swan risks, which cannot be managed possibly. There are political risks and there are foreign exchange risks over there, even if we keep them out. Effectively, the underlying theory and the construct through which capital works is risk-adjusted return and risk-adjusted return over capital, and it goes by capital asset pricing models. And these models, which, whether it is in Wall Street or whether it is in London, whether it is in any financial hub and a center, they would distort the pricing of capital if that investment needs to happen in South America. Now, with this kind of a situation, how does one reduce the cost of finance? I think climate week after climate week, COP after COP, many of you, probably a lot of you who have been visiting, and these are terms which are easily known and available. Public finance needs to leverage blended finance, and there is de-risking of investments that need to happen. We hear all of this. But when I look at the total pools of capital with these instruments globally, they come out to be a very, very minuscule number. Total up all blended finance availability, total up all risk mitigation, structures and instruments available, that the maths does not match. Now, therefore, what I'm thinking of is, and this is just a proposal, that 5 years ago at COP, at 2018 COP, this structure was launched by International Solar Alliance. An attempt was made to pool the risks and some sort of socialize so that investors can be directed to both renewable energy and emerging markets. But that did not take off then. A possible modification is what is up on this slide, that putting global institutions together and the sovereigns together to possibly de-risk in some sort of a structure which essentially works, can be managed by an international institution, but that socializes the cost of capital, because we are talking about a global common cause. It absorbs the cost of capital, not really through putting idle capital, but it could be a callable or a sovereign kind of a callable capital, which could be set up by, let's say, larger OECD countries, maybe G7. So it's just a conceptual structure where the need to socialize cost of finance is extremely important, so that investment in renewable energy flows to renewable energy into the right countries. So I want to make a few points here. Net zero emissions grid is a prerequisite to overall energy transition and net zero. Without ramp up of RE and associated grid infrastructure, thermal power plants will keep on going. Net zero grid requires significant capital allocation and shift to both RE and to emerging countries and large potential I would say, large solar and wind resource countries. And for that, the key points are that how do we shift capital allocation? If capital allocation has to be shifted and the risk returns relationship is not conducive to that, there is a need for a global approach to institutionalize and socialize the cost of capital. Ultimately, what we are dealing with is a global common cause. Thank you.
Okay, yes. So we will now move to our discussion session. We'll have, as in other panels, 2 microphones here for those who want to pose questions. For those who are watching over the internet, you can use the chat function, and we will be reading those questions and providing some answers. So we have here already a first question. Please go ahead.
On?
No.
There we go. My name is Moira Burse. I work with Amazon Watch. So we work in coordination and collaboration with indigenous communities across the Amazon basin on land rights protection, fighting extractive projects, defending the rainforest, land rights, things like that. And so one question is, I think, specifically for Johanna, and then maybe a more general question. In your presentation, you presented some slides about the sort of feasibility of 100% renewable build. I think that was globally, although maybe it was just Australia. And I'm curious about how much consideration may or may not have gone into those calculations around consulting with local communities and what kinds of opposition might be faced, and how those kinds of demands from local communities about the impacts of build-out would have in there on the feasibility of specific projects. And then sort of a more general question for everyone, or whomever wants to answer, is how are you thinking about the issue of local community impacts in the renewable build-out, and how to avoid some of the many pitfalls of the extractive industry in running roughshod over community rights, facing opposition and project delays and cancellations because of ignoring the importance of consulting?
Thanks, really good question. So the 100% renewable energy studies that I referred to, those ones were global, and there's probably something like 15 or so different studies looking at 100% renewable energy global feasibility. And some of them look at land. In particular, one of them from Stanford looked at the land requirements for reaching that 100% renewable energy system, found that around 0.5% of the countries in that study, 0.5% of the land of those countries would be required for the renewables build out, which, in some countries, they'll be significantly more, in some countries significantly less, obviously depending on population, but land use is a really important consideration, and it is a challenge that that is we're seeing in Australia's renewables build out. It's not just the solar and wind farms that it's difficult to find the right land for, but it's also the transmission lines. So a huge amount of new transmission needs to be built, and the plan is to put these renewable energy zones in different parts of the country which have wind and solar plants all in one location, and build out a transmission line to that. But in building out a transmission line, you go through such a big area that it's quite difficult to make sure that it's okay for all of the communities in that area. But yes, stakeholder engagement is really important, and I think a lot of the renewable project developers are trying to do more of that. I think it's also about sharing of the benefits. So do those communities share in the benefits that the transmission networks and that the renewables projects are receiving? And it's also about really tight regulations, so making sure that the planning rules and regulations are sufficient to prevent any environmental degradation of really important ecosystems. So yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important thing that we need to be aware of in the renewables build out, because there is a significant amount of land required. Yes, yes. Mm. Did you want to?
I can just echo a few of those points in the Indian context. We are seeing, because of the focus on India's RE, which has grown so rapidly in the last 5 years, has been largely utility scale. We have some huge projects. Land is always a contentious issue anywhere in the developing world, and especially so in India. There's a lot of competing requirements for that land. The issue of land rights and what's on paper as opposed to customary use is a big challenge. So in some cases you'll have it's government land, so it could technically just be used for a government project. But there are communities that use that land for maybe for grazing or maybe for some kind of other informal use. So those are issues that are can be really problematic. And I think that drives home the need to balance your utility scale. You will need utility scale stuff, but balance that with decentralized and distributed. And that's where in India, for sure, that part of the target has been we've woefully underperformed on that. I think there's a presentation on that some point in the last 2 or 3 days. So I think that's critical. Like rooftops and other smaller decentralized installations the pace on that has to pick up. Those avoid most of the challenges that you see with land. And the other thing is, of course, just making sure there's community consent, involvement, and benefit sharing. Because I don't think there's a shortage of land. There's not a shortage of poor quality land, if you like, that is not really productive in other ways to be used. But ensuring that the community is on board and that you share benefits in some way, I think that's going to be critical.
Well, I would just comment in the case of Puerto Rico, where land is so limited, it has precisely been that the reason for delays in being able to attain renewable energy goals, because the focus of government has been large-scale projects located in agricultural valuable lands or ecologically sensitive lands. And the focus that community groups are trying to advance is precisely rooftop solar with some large scale, but located in close landfills, brownfield areas. But still there is a great contention and adversity between government's approach, which is obviously not taking into consideration any type of community input. There is no community participation, and what groups locally are claiming. So that is a very vivid situation on the island and in a place like Puerto Rico, where we need to use every available piece of land for agricultural and food security. Another question?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the presentation. So I'm Steve Hers with the Sierra Club, and my question was for Dhruba. So you put up a really interesting slide about sequencing decarbonization, and I'm sorry you skimmed over it pretty quickly, so I didn't quite catch it. But as I'm sure you're aware, there are a number of initiatives out there, JETPs, the Asian Development Bank has an initiative to start to pay for closure for coal plants in some high-emitting developing countries. And I'm just wondering how you think about those initiatives in terms of the sequencing that you put out. I'm wondering if you think paying for closure in a highly coal-dependent country is premature, and if that money could be better used towards just investing in renewables.
Thank you. Very interesting question. Yeah, I am aware of JETP and is the G7, G20 partnerships, let's say. South Africa has been handled by Europe. India is being handled by US and Germany. I think Indonesia currently in action is being handled by US also. So I don't think they are premature. I think they're important. When I spoke about sequencing, it is about the prescription of Energy Transitions Commission, Lord Turner's commission, which was set up many, many years ago. The sequencing was possibly the sequencing required to build up infrastructure, renewable, and then talk about, so if you look at the steps in that boxes that I had put, it's not my way, but the boxes were no new coal. Yeah, sure, no new coal. But the question remains that if your renewable, which does not satisfy the growth in electricity demand, you will not be able to retire thermal coal plants. The question is, if it is possible to do it in a synchronous manner, yeah, please go ahead. Absolutely. So I am not necessarily placing a sequence, but I'm putting the blocks in place so that the cart does not come before the horse.
I just also like to add, because this has been a question that's come up in Australia as well, should we pay for closure of the coal-fired power plants? And one thing is that, okay, if they are having reducing profitability, are they at risk of exiting before we have built supply to replace them? And, you know, when you have that situation, there may be some calls for a subsidy to keep them going until such a point in time when they're replaced and then they can be closed. And if you would have anything like that, it should only be, you know, you should look at the books and make sure it's just to keep them cash flow neutral. So it's not a payment that is like excessive. Because I know there has been in Germany, for example, there was the auction scheme, and there was some work done with IEEFA by the European IEEFA team, finding that the auctions for closure in Germany ended up to be quite expensive, and were paying for plants that were probably not profitable and might have just closed if they hadn't been paid extra. So the payment for closure can sometimes end up being a payment that keeps them open. So yeah, it's something to be careful about, and we would always just, in Australia, we'll say like only for absolutely necessary and only to keep them cash flow neutral. And then there has been an example in Australia where there was an agreement made between a coal-fired power plant and the Victorian government, which is not transparent, and it was, I guess, yeah, it's a commercial in confidence agreement, and we never found out how much that coal-fired power plant is going to be subsidised. So these kind of agreements are also, you want to be careful and make sure there's a lot more information than that, because it could be quite an expensive thing to the taxpayer in the end, but it's all a private agreement. So yeah, I think any of those schemes need to be approached with caution.
Yeah, I just add that I think a lot of it is very, there will be a lot of country specificity involved. So for example, in India, we have a huge overcapacity problem. There is just more generation capacity than we need on the grid already. Plant load factors for the coal fleet have been declining steadily, and they're now below 60% in the 50s. So there's excess capacity, and it's possible to, RE is continuing to come on stream at a decent pace. Yes, that needs to be faster, but you can also take off some of the old, inefficient, more polluting power plants at the same time. I'm sure that will be the case with some other geographies as well. I mean, globally, there's a coal overcapacity issues. So,
Dhruba, you had an additional
No,
comment?
I just wanted to make the point, while agreeing with what Ashish said, yes, you can take. For India, if you look at the plans for renewable, they're huge. But if you get back to some other countries and look at what is Brazil's plans, what is Indonesia's plans, even the JETP countries, look at their plans on paper of renewable ramping up. I don't think they're sufficient. Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, yeah, they're not sufficient. Philippines, Vietnam. If the renewable ramp up, if you look at India's plan of renewable 500 gigawatt is a huge scale. But if you look at what's on the pipeline in the other JETP countries, you will not cross 100 gigawatt in anywhere. It will be 30, 40. So all I'm trying to caution the approach over here that, and it's also driven by the fact that let's also recognize that even today we have 900 million to 1 billion people without access to electricity, and about 2.5 billion people of 7.5 billion Earth without access to clean cooking. So let's recognize that there are issues which are different, which are development issues and energy poverty issues. So they have to be balanced along with it. If your renewable were to move towards delivering that, as in many parts of Africa, you will get there. But yeah, there are numbers which are staggering from various perspectives.
Vivian, do we have an online question?
Yes, we have 3 questions. Should I give you all of them together, or would you rather have?
If we could do it sequentially, I think it's better.
Okay, so the first one is, how is Tasmania, which is almost like an island, able to get its imports and exports? How is this working?
Yeah, so that's a quick one. So that has an undersea cable connecting Tasmania into Victoria, and they are planning to upgrade that and build another one so that Tasmania can export more renewable energy to the other states. But yeah, it's a subsea cable.
To the next one. This is for Ashish. How are new amendments in open access going to enable renewable energy in India? What do you think will be the challenges, especially with discoms?
So I think the new amendments to the open access, which basically made it easier for large consumers, corporate consumers in particular, to purchase dedicated renewable energy, that could really be a game changer. And it's early days yet. It's just, I think, only a few months old. So, but it's really good. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't have a simple answer to the question of what the challenge is for discoms, because they're probably going to start losing. They have already been losing, but they're going to continue losing some of their higher paying customers. In India, we cross-subsidize the tariffs, so they pay a higher tariff in order to subsidize agriculture and lower income communities. So that is going to be a problem for the discoms. And that's part of what we are looking at in our analysis, because stopping building new coal and taking off some of the older coal actually will help revive the distribution companies' finances. The major reason they're in so much trouble is because they have spent excessively on new coal power plants, and because of the subsidy issue, the government is basically subsidizing expensive coal power. So if you can bring down the generation cost by RE, by using more and more RE, that actually helps to address that issue.
Just to add to what Ashish said, is a small tweak in the existing regulation in India, which is called merit order dispatch, which keeps capacities idling and therefore old plants going on. A small tweak will help a lot in these renewable energy open access consumers to actually consume much more renewable energy. So just adding to that point, but it needs a small tweak in the existing regulation, electricity regulation. That's a separate Pandora's box.
Let's take the question from the gentleman who's been waiting here in line for a while, and then we'll go back to the online, and then.
Okay, some really good and amazing presentation. I'm Asif from Pakistan. I just wanted to ask, don't you think that strategies like net zero emissions are kind of weakening the global voices to keep the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius to achieve the target? Don't you think that these kinds of strategies are kind of challenge for the developing worlds, that it would be difficult to keep the threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because I think the strategies like net zero emissions are still allowing a path for more emissions. It's not kind of completely like controlling the emissions, but still allowing the window for the emission globally. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, okay. Let me try my best to kind of approach this, and I'll use a previous jargon called carbon neutrality. Well, essentially, carbon neutrality was about scope 1 and scope 2 equals 0 for any economic activity. In a net zero, what you're saying, everything is 0 in emissions, and whatever residual emissions are remaining, that the forest will extract it out. So there will be residual emissions. So I don't think as a concept, there is anything wrong, because it's directed towards whether it will be achieved from a 1.5 trajectory. And if you look at pathways of RCP, etc., it looks difficult, surely looks difficult. But at the same point of time, I do acknowledge your point that at a global level, what we are trying is, we're trying to solve a problem of stock by limiting flow, because the stock is already there. If you look at the carbon stock, which is crossed, if your limits for 1.5 and 2 were to be 450 ppm, you're already crossing 400. So it's like saying that you had some 5 kg of food to be eaten, you've already eaten 4.5 kg, you're left with 50 grams or 500 grams, which you are trying to reduce as much as possible on a carbon budget. But that point acknowledged, but the direction towards net zero in this trajectory as a concept and a strategy, I don't think there is anything wrong in it.
I think that, if you have a net zero by 2050, there's a risk that governments and industry don't make action in the short term. So it's really important to have all these short-term ambitious goals in all sectors to reduce emissions, and with the end state of getting to net zero, but not delaying in the steps towards getting there, trying to make as much fast action as quickly as possible.
Vivian, go ahead.
Yeah, this question is for Dhruba. African nations have high debt burdens, high cost of borrowing, foreign exchange risk, and sovereign risk.
Right.
How do you think sub-Saharan countries can be brought into a stable and scaled up clean energy finance stream to actually see grid and renewable build-outs happen?
Thank you. Great question. And maybe all sub-Saharan Africa cannot be painted with the same brush, but you have countries where access is a problem, where the grid has not reached a distributed renewable pathway should be adopted, because the cost of extending the grid is far higher than using distributed renewable energy, which makes it easier. But having said that, the first part of the question is, have huge political risk, have huge foreign exchange risks. So when I presented, in my presentation, I was talking about political risk and foreign exchange risk, and there are two institutions in the world who need to play a bigger role in this. One is MIGA, which can assume the political risk. And there was a multilateral development bank created, another institution called TCX, which can be scaled up to manage foreign exchange risk. Because if you leave political risk and foreign exchange risk to be managed by capital, then this investments in renewable energy are not going anywhere to sub-Saharan Africa very clearly. They have to be lifted out. So the 101 of risk management talks about unbundling risks and placing them with institutions who are best equipped to manage. So political risk management institution globally is MIGA, and TCX manages foreign exchange risk for any financing, so you can transfer them there. But at the same time, it still leaves it with the credit risk, the sovereign risk, the project risk, which is the risk of capital, and therefore it escalates the cost required for the returns required for sub-Saharan Africa. That is where I'm proposing socializing the risk distribution so that it can be distributed across to probably and transferred to OECD countries. Thanks.
You almost answered my question, Dhruba. Hi, I'm Sass with Bowyer Climate Fund, but I spent a decade working in the nonprofit sector on the IFIs and the banks, and MIGA was always this institution that we just kind of ignored from a climate and energy perspective. And you more or less answered it. I was intrigued by that model you mentioned there. Should we be looking at MIGA perhaps as a community to engage more as a vehicle to do these risk guarantees, or should we think about an institution? Should we engage more with the existing institutions itself?
Great question, thanks. If you look at the COP Bonn presentation of CRMM, this was sort of expectation that it will be MIGA, yes. But somehow the entire institutional effort, sort of under the umbrella of International Solar Alliance, in which it was led by Terawatt Initiative, it had World Bank also, somewhere that fizzled out. But yes, I would assume very clearly that MIGA has a role to play if one were to manage political risk. I am not aware of any other institution which takes up political risk and guarantees against that. And therefore, if it is a global public good that we are addressing, and it's a global issue, if you don't get the emerging markets or the investments in emerging markets, you're not going to get there. Therefore, MIGA needs to play a role for sure in these risks. But MIGA may not be able to handle FX risk, and therefore I was suggesting something else. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Last question. From small to influencing big, how much can investing in housing efficiency and distributed solar make the larger financial movement to renewables happen?
Small has a role to play. Very clearly, distributed renewable energy has a significant, we saw it in a couple of presentations earlier, and distributed renewable energy takes you off the grid. And there is the question, therefore, comes back in saying, Do we sustain the grid? Do we let the grid die? Now, grid remains the key. If we can work out some convergence without some sort of defecting from the grid or going against the grid, and the grid anyway claws back in various ways in Australia and India and many other places, I guess we need to work out a more amicable in-between path in integrating both the small, I would say the distributed renewable energy along with the grid, and that convergence would be useful.
Yeah, I think it's about, harnessing the power of these distributed energy resources to provide services to the grid. So, using the electric vehicle battery energy storage to provide power in the grid in the evenings at times when it's needed through vehicle to grid. It's also about, having the small scale loads, household loads, etc., more tied with the renewable energy supply, so having better demand response. Energy efficiency is obviously important to reduce the supply needed from the grid, but all of these demand side parts of the equation and the small scale renewables parts of the equation are really important, and they are going to help with reducing emissions. We're seeing that in Australia. Australia has the highest rooftop PV installed per capita, and so we're seeing rooftop solar is really a huge amount of supply in the middle of the day, and then storage is also coming into play, and that's helping reduce emissions significantly. And so households have had a huge role in the energy transition in Australia, and that is actually projected to continue. So in 2050, they say about 40% of the capacity in the grid is going to be consumer-owned resources, so rooftop PV, distributed batteries, and electric vehicles. And so that's a huge amount of investment and value in energy resources that are owned by consumers, and it'll be about making sure we can communicate with those resources and use those resources to serve not just the consumer who owns them, but also the rest of the grid as well, so to get the best benefit out of them as possible.
Yeah, I think the question also touches on something that we often ignore, which is efficiency. It's like the stepchild. No one wants to talk about efficiency because it's boring, but that's critical. We will not be able to get to a zero emissions grid if we continue to grow demand and don't address efficiency. It's going to make our job that much more difficult. So what does efficiency look like in the developed world versus in the developing world? Very different solutions you're talking about there, heating versus cooling. But there's a huge role for efficiency, and there's a huge role to mobilize investments in efficiency, whether it's more efficient cooling, heat pumps, all of that kind of stuff, induction cooking as opposed to natural gas. I mean, there's just so much that needs to be done there. It's not being done there.
I would just add that I would say it's quite location dependent as well, because if you're located in Hurricane Avenue, like the Caribbean is, then the grid becomes the risk. So the very distributed solutions then are the resilient solutions. And even though the grid can provide additional services under normal conditions, if you're talking about climate threats, then you really have to focus on distributed solar as probably the first alternative. I don't know if we have other questions online. Oh, we do have
one. Hi, I'm Aditi with the Rainforest Action Network. So there's been a lot of focus on shifting financial flows away from fossil fuels. The GFANs is a sort of alliance of private financial institutions. Thinking about the role private finance can play in the shift to renewables, I'm curious if you can sort of share a little bit about that. I heard Dhruba talk a role about public finance, really de-risking private finance, but as we think about and sort of members of GFANs, for example, and the race to zero criteria that they are supposed to sort of adopt and meet, what does that actually look like in terms of investing and financing renewables?
Yeah, thanks. If you looked at the entire, as I said, the declaration was $130 billion, but if you totaled up all the institutions which signed up to GFANs, the total balance sheets were 130 billion. So it didn't mean that 130 billion is going to renewable or 130 billion is going to green or any such investments. If you look at the share of increase of particularly institutional investors in renewable energy, that's minuscule and even smaller when you shift to, let's say, emerging markets, far smaller. Now, if I'm getting your question correctly, it's the question of, you're sort of asking what can public finance do to enable this to happen? And if this is what you're asking, when I presented that slide, what I meant was, you need to create a pooled structure or any new structure. It can be something like a GCF, but what is GCF size? It's just $10 billion. Now, while capital is scarce and therefore even public finance cannot put in capital, let's rely on the power of sovereign or the power of seniority of well credit rated, high credit rated G7 economies to provide what is called callable capital, to create the structure in terms of making it contingent to any form of default. Now, what you do by that mechanism is you will enable the same GFANS investors end up investing in a high potential, let's say Argentina or Chile has a very high solar potential. In fact, efficiencies down south often exceed 20% or more. Now, you'll be able to direct that capital. So the point I'm making very clear is there are two things. One is typically markets don't allow capital to get directed, or it is not supposed to be done. But we are faced with a situation where institutional structures need to be created so that global capital gets directed to where it should go to. Otherwise, if you leave capital on its own, it will find, like water finds its own level. But the need of the hour, and here of what we are talking on net zero emissions grid, is the need to direct capital, both public and private market capital. The public sits below the market capital so that it takes the risk. But even public is insufficient, and therefore I'm creating another structure and saying, let this be contingent, let this rely on the power of the sovereign.
Do we have another question, final question? Oh, we have one online and one over here.
Well, we do, but I think we're out of time. And this is a question about lithium, so we can answer that one offline, I think.
So we'll take this gentleman's question as the last question.
I'm just very interested to hear your quick thoughts on development timelines for renewables projects in your respective markets, especially with the global energy commodity crisis expected to last for several years. So just how quickly are we talking in terms of scaling these projects up? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the development timelines in Australia, so battery energy storage projects can be something like 6 months or so. Wind is more like 3 years, solar something similar. But you have also the transmission lines are actually taking a lot longer and really need a lot of planning, huge investment. And that's what's holding things up at the moment, is the transmission lines. And so, yeah, they have had delays in all of the projects in Australia from supply chain issues, but also from these blockages from transmission lines taking too long to get installed. And so, yeah, I think it is there's a big question mark over our plan, because, you know, the best laid plans, like you can have them, but is the timing going to work out? Well, all that we can do is just keep moving along. But I think it's affecting everywhere, and we're seeing that, you know, we had these dramatic reductions in solar module prices and wind as well, but that's kind of come back up slightly. Either prices have risen or plateaued, and so that's affecting the rollout of renewables in Australia for sure. And it's probably likely to last a few more years, but it's still, people are still moving as quickly as they can given the constraints.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in India, in the before times, it was generally like 2 to 3 years for solar would be the normal what you could expect. But COVID just threw that for a toss. So I think I'm not sure we've gotten back to a new normal, and especially there's been some really strange policy issues in India that have caused more confusion in terms of import tariffs and customs duties and stuff like that. So I think I'm not sure that we actually have a proper yardstick for now, what it's like now. I know Jyoti is here, but she might have a better idea from GMK on what that looks like. I don't know, Dhruba, do you have any?
I mean, it remains, in the sense it remains open.
Yeah. The expectation is still 2 to 3 years, but I'm not sure that that's actually being met for a utility scale solar project.
Well, thank you all for this great final discussion in the IEEFA conference. Please join me in a round of applause to this excellent panel.